Yesterday, I was privileged to be part of the 40th anniversary of Beacon Hills College in Pakenham, where I was chaplain quite a number of years ago. And it was great to hear Reverend Roger Rich, who was the visionary pastor there at the time, describe the past and describe the faith and the vision of some of the people who were particularly involved in the launching of the school in 1982, just a very small number of students in year 7 to start the school. And how the people there had no background in starting a school. Roger Rich hadn't. The parents who were anticipating this event had no quite experience. They felt like they were totally inadequate for the task and having to learn as they went. But he described how, quoting some words of this parent couple who were involved, of how everything seemed to fall into place, as if the hand of God was upon the whole venture. And this sense of God's vision, God's calling, and God having his hand, despite difficulties along the way, as any venture of that nature would have, this sense of starting something that you sense God calling and putting in your hands to do. Maybe seems small to the beginning, but now Beacon Hills is a multi-campus school with thousands of students and an excellent reputation throughout a very burgeoning community. So in a sense, those people were making apostolic action, weren't they? They were breaking new ground. They were pioneers. They had a sense of God's call, that God had sent them, and in reliance upon God and in prayer, they began the work. And today's readings, as I reflect on the three main readings there, I've entitled it The Three Apostles, because we have Peter and Paul and Jesus, who was an apostle, as well as prophet, priest, king, Lord and Saviour, because Jesus was sent by God, wasn't he? And he said, as God sent me, so I send you. So an apostle means someone who is sent. So I want to reflect a little bit on what we learn from these three apostles this morning, because in our creed we say we are one holy Catholic and apostolic church. So we share the apostleship of Jesus. We also are sent ones in whatever God has placed in our hands, whatever area of influence, of leadership, of whatever context of relationships in which God has placed us as his sent ones to be salt and light and a bridge for others to see him even in us. So firstly, Peter, the impetuous, passionate, what you see is what you get, foot in the mouth, Peter, raw as you can find. And Peter, as we know, as soon as he recognises it's the Lord, he jumps into the water. Peter doesn't hold back, and he swims to Jesus. He was delighted that Jesus is alive. Peter is also, as we would realise, a humbled man at this stage. Peter, who in the courtyard, remember, had denied 3 times knowing Jesus. So I believe with Peter's delight and eagerness to get close to Jesus on this beach, there's also in Peter, some sense of uncertainty, some lingering sense of shame and uncertainty as to how will Jesus receive me? What's going to be the game plan now? Where do I stand with him? Well, after this lovely breakfast that some of you enjoyed a repetition of on Easter morning, very early by the beach, Jesus takes Peter for a walk along the beach and asks him 3 times if Peter loves him. Why do you think Jesus did that? Jesus was the master of pastoral care, wasn't he? And when we fail, when we mess up in a relationship, we long for the restoration of that relationship, don't we? We long for that person to treat us once again as we were treated before, rather than the standoff or the frosty countenance. And here Jesus walks Peter through an experience of healing, an experience of affirmation, and enables Peter to, in a sense, revisit the shame of his 3-time denial with the healing of a 3-time affirmation of his love for Jesus. And in response, each time Jesus says, "Feed my sheep, take care of my lambs, tend my sheep." And in such a way, reinstating Peter as that rock on which he had said he would build his church. Peter, the wounded healer. There's a sense in which for any of us, if we're to exercise leadership, we're to learn the lesson, aren't we, that all of us have our own frailties, that we are certainly not placed in leadership because we're perfect or have it all together. It's God's call upon us to learn to trust in him and to allow his strength to function in our weakness. And Peter learnt this lesson, as in his epistle, 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter says to fellow elders and pastors, "Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, serving as overseers, not because you must, but because you are willing, not greedy for money, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock, clothing yourselves with humility, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble." And it's been a joy to me as I've come among you in this last 8 months or so to witness the exercise of servant leadership amongst those in your parish council and those entrusted with various roles in this church community, and to see their eagerness and commitment to service and acknowledging their dependence on God through their prayerfulness. Now, many of you, if not all of you, at various stages of your life have had roles of leadership. If you've been a parent, you've had a leadership role, haven't you, within family, leading children. Some of you in community organisations, some of you within the church in various roles. And so you've learnt through the school of hard knocks the importance of trusting God in such a role and the call of God to serve others with the influence that he's given you at whatever time and context. So Peter learnt that to exercise his apostleship. Love for Jesus and desire to please him is to become the prime motivation. This was also the experience of Saul in our next reading, the reading about from Acts, where Paul, formerly called Saul, on the road to Damascus, that fierce persecutor of Christians, he was going to Damascus to arrest any who are followers of the way. The way was the early label for those who followed Jesus as Messiah. And Saul had gone there, but on the way he had this dramatic encounter with Jesus, this bright light that shone and dazzled him and blinded him. And his companions heard a voice and saw the light, but they couldn't understand what was being said. It's even now people talk about, a road to Damascus experience, don't they? It's become part of our language. Paul, in this encounter with Jesus, received a call upon his life, just as Peter did receive that call to follow Jesus and to be the rock on which Jesus would build his church and to tend his sheep. So Paul received a call from Jesus directly to take the message of Christ to the Gentiles, beyond that fixed boundary that Israel saw of the Jewish people, to non-Jews, who they saw as heathen, pagan, unclean, godless, terrible people to keep away from. Radically, dramatically, God in his love in Jesus said, "No, Paul, I'm calling you to take my message to non-Jews, to the rest of the world. But you will suffer greatly." It says he showed Paul how much he would suffer. Paul never forgot his past. He describes himself in one of his letters as the chief of sinners. You reckon you've blown it along the way and done some terrible things? Well, look at me, says Paul. I arrested Christians and voted to have them put to death. said, I'm the worst of sinners, but God chose me, not because I'm worthy, and that's a key here. God doesn't call us and choose us because we're more worthy than anyone else, but in order to display the power of his grace. And that's what Paul says. He chose me, the chief of sinners, to display the limitlessness of his grace and his mercy through me. And in response, Paul says, he was even more earnest in pursuing and fulfilling God's call on his life. Paul, who has changed Western history, when you think about it, Paul, the author of more than half of the New Testament, the book of Acts talks mainly about Paul's missionary journeys. And Paul wrote letters to Corinth, Galatia, Philippians, Colossians. Paul wrote all these letters. And then the letters to Timothy and Titus. So Paul was so instrumental, and humanly speaking, he was the main cause for the spread of Christian faith throughout the known world at that time, right up to Rome, in the Roman Empire, as his ceaseless travels and preaching under incredible opposition and duress and threats to his life. Paul was aware of his vulnerability, and in a beautiful letter, 2 Corinthians, if ever you haven't read that, the second letter to the Corinth is Paul's opening his heart and bearing times of depression where he despaired even of life itself. He considered he'd had a death sentence, and yet he said that these things happened to him so that he might depend not on his own strength, but on God who raises the dead. Paul talks about, he boasts in his weaknesses, because he says, when I am weak, then the power of God rests on me. When I'm weak, then I'm strong, because it's God's strength. This is a key to being one of God's servants, one of God's people, discovering that in our weakness, we don't give up. We don't rule ourselves out of contention because, how could God use me? Inadequate, weak, sinful, mistake-burdened me. No, that qualifies us. It's not the worthy, but the willing that God chooses, because then in our weakness, his grace, his strength is what people see, and that's what they need, Jesus. So our final apostle, the greatest apostle of them all, Jesus, is focused in our final reading in Revelation. This vision of John, the apostle in his very later years, the only apostle who didn't die a martyr's death, John, who lived to a great age, and received this vision on Patmos, full of symbolism, where Jesus is depicted as a lamb that was slain. And I chose not to use such a picture for you this morning, so I've got something that's maybe not so grotesque as a lamb that was slain. But interesting that it's that symbol that is used for Jesus there in Revelation. When the gathering there before God's throne in this heavenly scene that's depicted, where there's a scroll, the scroll of God's final judgment, and no one is found worthy to open that scroll. And John cries because no one is found worthy. And then they say, no, behold, look, here is the one who is worthy, the lamb that was slain. It's an image of Jesus, who became the sacrificial lamb, the one who opened not his mouth, who didn't answer back to Pontius Pilate, but like a lamb was led to the slaughter, but to pay for our sins, yours and mine, and to be raised again. Jesus is praised by the company of heaven, the living creatures, the elders, those in God's company. For with his blood he has purchased men and women for God, from every tribe, language, people and nation. Jesus, the Lamb that was slain, now the risen Lord of heaven and earth, who has chosen us and called us to be a kingdom of priests. This is an amazing truth. Us, with all our inadequacy and unworthiness, God, through Jesus, has called us, made us an apostolic church, the sent ones, to be bridges for people who don't yet know Jesus, to be a bridge in our very life, light and salt, so that people might see something in us of the love of God something in us of the truth of the message of Christ in our words and in the integrity of lives. This calling for us to be priests, and the word priest in Latin is pontifex, it means a bridge, someone who's a bridge between people and God. And that calling was the original calling to Israel. Way back in Exodus, when they're brought out of Egypt, these words God said to them, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Israel was always meant to be that bridge to the rest of the world of God's reality, so that all might come to know him. And we know that Israel naturally could not fulfill that task, even though their legacy throughout the earth historically is astounding, isn't it? When we consider the wide fields of endeavour in which Jewish people have excelled and been pioneers and leaders, being salt and light throughout the earth. Yet still Israel failed, as we all do. But no, there is one who is worthy to open the scroll. It is Jesus alone, the sinless one, who proved faithful to God as prophet, priest and king, without sin, giving up his own lifeblood to cleanse us and to cover our inadequacies and our sin, Jew and Gentile. By his blood, Jesus has redeemed us from guilt and shame and recovered us for the gracious purposes of God. So the question is not, are we worthy, as Peter and Paul both had to discover for themselves, but are we willing to follow the one who is worthy and to allow him to be strong in and through us, the one who's removed our guilt, our shame, and placed us in a privileged and intimate relationship with God as Father, Abba, Daddy, the God of the whole universe. We are to be his people, his bridges, through which others may come and find access to God, a God who loves them and gave himself for them. Now, we will feel inadequate for this task. But I think of Tony Ronaldo. I just mentioned him in the recorded message for Easter Day. The World Vision agronomist who in Africa is transforming the desert into a forest by discovering and helping people to nurture shrubs that are actually trees that are underground. And I watched last night through a Zoom meeting the launch of his book called The Underground Forest, Hope for a Planet in Crisis. And in this he tells his own personal story of faith, and as I've mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago, how God led him to discover this forest underground and to then train people, the African people, how to nurture the reforestation. But he describes the most influential person in his life, which was his mother, a woman of faith. And I want to say to you, you might think, well, gee, I'm not going to be a person who transforms the planet and saves Earth to the extent of a Tony Ronaldo, but as a woman or man of faith, as a grandmother or grandfather, you have incredible influence in young people, way beyond what you imagine, through your prayers and your faithfulness to God and to the local community of faith. So do not underestimate your influence and the seeds that you sow as you have opportunity. There's a true story told of a young man called Billy McMakin, who was not much of an evangelist. He had a heart for Jesus and he wanted to share Jesus with others. And he sought to invite people and take them along to crusades and meetings of evangelists. It's an American context. And there was this visiting speaker coming and he wanted to take people there, and he invited this young man in his village, in his town, and this guy wasn't interested. But he thought, I know how I can get him to come. He said, I'll let you drive my truck. He thought, oh, and this is a young guy and a chance to drive the truck. That was something. So he drove the truck in, and while the meeting was going, he sort of crept up to the back and listened to this speaker and was transfixed. and over time gave his life to Jesus. And that young man's name was, as some of you may know, Billy Graham, who has had more influence on people in these generations and proclaimed Jesus to millions of people across the world. Now, Billy McMakin, none of us have heard of him, and he didn't think he had much influence, but he was able to invite one person. So I want to encourage us today, as we learn from these three apostles, that inadequacy is not a disqualification. A past with elements of which we may be ashamed is not a disqualification from being sent and called by God and having influence for Jesus. But rather, it's the very means by which God's strength can come and show through us, and often by which other people can feel closer to us because, oh, you're not perfect either. And so we can be real before the cross of Jesus. So as we come for communion today, might we use this act of faith as a rededication of ourselves as members of Christ's apostolic church, his royal priesthood, the one who might direct the influence that we each have to point others to him, to use our opportunities to be bridges of the King, mindful that our very weaknesses and inadequacies are opportunities for God to show his strength and for us to learn to trust him ever more deeply and his power working through us. Shall we pray?